see the participant count rise pretty quickly.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. Hi, Joe. Hello. Good evening, students and guests. Hello. Mariana, usually there's a third person. We have a I kind of manage the course, and then we have a host faculty that is here with us. So this is probably, I think this might be the first time this semester where our students just see two here.
Nice. Wow, that is a huge number, 259. Wow, like it just jumps. It's crazy.
Yeah. It'll start to, as you know, our students have complicated lives, and sometimes they have to miss. And out of 350 or so, we usually start to level off around 320, something like that. Mm-hmm. Hi, everybody.
I wonder if I know anybody in the audience. So is it a range of levels?
We have a giant range. So everyone from first years up through grads, and potentially there's some faculty out there too in the audience.
So I'm going to go turn off my air compressor that's just kicked on in the background. I don't know if you can hear that. That's
yeah. Please take your time. We have plenty of time. Hi, anonymous attendee. Today was pretty good. It's a beautiful day, as you all know, if you're in Long Beach or the area. I'm definitely a warm weather kind of fella, so this is all feeling pretty good to me. And I'm sure all y'all are getting ready for spring break,
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It's like your last class before spring break, probably, or one of the last classes that they have this week.
We're ticking them off for sure. Maybe I should mention a couple things just about that to you all students out there. We'll give you a break on the response paper for this week. Let's have it in by the Tuesday after spring break. All right, I know I'll get questions about that. many questions, right. Even still. What am I doing for spring break? I got some family coming to town, so that's nice. My sister is getting married, so we have some wedding stuff to do, and yeah, trying to catch up a little bit on some things, as I'm sure everybody is. Maybe take a short break, get in the studio.
Yeah, finally.
Studio. Yeah. Mariana, if you're okay, we'll kind of get things rolling, and please, you use, we are here to serve you, so you take your time, you go at your pace, and we will come back around for Q&As whenever you feel that you're through. Everybody, a reminder as we go through the evening this evening, populate the Q&A. Keep questions out of the chat, put all questions in the Q&A just to help us kind of keep things in order. And feel free to do that at any time during the lecture this evening. And then we'll, again, we'll come back around and we'll answer those questions, the ones that we can anyway, when we're through here. So Mariana Pomonis, I'm going to read your very impressive bio right now. is a Los Angeles-based artist. In 2023, so coming up here, and I'm sure you're working heavily on this right now, Pomonis will have a solo show in Eastern Washington University in Spokane, Washington. Pomonis has shown at galleries and institutions, including the Lancaster Museum of Art and History, Western Carolina University Museum of Fine Arts, the Torrance Art Museum, the Mildred Lane Kemper Museum in St. Louis, the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Los Angeles, Post in Los Angeles, the Annie Wharton in Los Angeles, the Diana Lowenstein Fine Arts in Miami, the Cirrus Gallery in Los Angeles, Space Bee Gallery in New York, the iSpace Gallery in Chicago. Her artwork and projects has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the Huffington Post, Artillery Magazine, Art Forum, Freeze, Hyper, Allergic, National Public Radio, White Hot Magazine, Yale University Radio, and Art Week. Additionally, her curatorial projects and essays have been featured at commercial and institutional galleries such as the Vincent Price Art Museum, the Whittier College Greenleaf Gallery, Post, Peter Miller Gallery, and Circus Gallery. Mary Ann Pomonis, thank you so much for coming and speaking to our students and our guests this evening. I hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
So much. And like, it's when you're leading that laundry list of things, I want everybody to keep in mind that I remember my first painting instructor telling me to put on my resume the first show that I had at the college gallery on campus, which was actually sort of part of the library where I went to school at the University of Illinois. And I said, why on earth should I do that? And he said, no, because now you're an artist, you're an exhibiting artist, and every time you're in a show, you write it down. It's right. Super important to keep that list, and someday you will thank me if you keep it running as a document and you never let that document go. And you know, that professor was Norman Akers, who's a tremendous Indigenous artist from Oklahoma, who I was lucky to learn from at the University of Illinois. And I always think of him whenever when somebody reads that, because some of those things that are listed on there sound super impressive, but they're things that I did like when I was in graduate school a long time ago, but you never lose it if it's on your resume, and you do think about it and you're more diligent about sharing it with people if you keep that list going. So write everything down, and never at any point in your life ask or expect anybody to do that for you. And I think that's the other thing that I really learned from him as an instructor, which is that you have to lean into your own work and also doing the work behind your work, that no one's ever going to do it for you. And that's been super helpful to me as an artist. And I felt like there have been a few instructors in my life who've given me little tiny pieces of advice like that have been foundational. So as a little shout out to Norman Akers, who is an incredible painter. If you're in the painting program and you're want to learn more about his work, I highly recommend you look at it. He was in a show at the Crystal Bridges Museum this year. I'm still in touch with him occasionally by email. And a lot of my instructors I'm still in touch with. And I think one of the reasons why, and I'll talk about that a little bit, is I'm very heavily invested in art education. That's the program that I taught in at Cal State Long Beach a few years ago. And it's the program that I'm teaching in now currently at Cal State Fullerton. So I'm someone who combines my interest in art and social practice. So those two things I see as being two sides of the same coin. So you're going to see evidence of that, not just my own work and my own personal production, but also the work of my friends and peers that I've helped organize in different ways in order to highlight their work and to bring more people into the conversation surrounding my work, so that my work is always part of a community and never, I think, solely thought of as independent and alone. And that's very important to me. It's one of the hallmarks of my pedagogy as an instructor, and one of the hallmarks of my values as a human being and as an artist. So I will share screen now. So another thing I'm going to tell you, which some of your instructors might disagree with me about, is that no matter what, basically, when I was beginning as a student, writing everything down meant literally writing it in a Word document and recording it that way. But now writing it down really means having a viable website that people can access information about you easily. I have listened, I have a gallery that represents me here in Los Angeles and one that represents me in Chicago, but I always maintain this site no matter what, even though independently the galleries maintain sites for me that are affiliated with the commercial entity that they run. But I think it's really important as an artist for you to maintain your focus and your vision, And creating a website and organizing it is part of that because it helps you to see all of your work. I think a wonderful lesson that Allison Stewart, who's a photographer who graduated from the grad program at Cal State Long Beach, taught me was to put artwork up around that I was working on all the time, so that I would see it when I woke up in the morning, see it when I looked at my computer, see it whenever I was in an area of my life, so that it would be fresh to me, so I could wake up in the morning or wake up into my day and see my work laid out before me so that I could understand it. Sometimes it takes a long time to understand what your work's about. I also have an archive of sketchbooks that goes back 25 years. And it's super valuable to me because I can look back at ideas that I can see the seed of that started when I was 19 years old. And that's something that I'm really excited about. I did have a really bad studio flood and lost a big section of them when I was in grad school, but I've filled up the years since then, which has been good. So anyway, this is an installation shot of my work at the at the Lancaster Museum of Art and History. So this space I was given, and a lot of times too, as an artist, you're given an opportunity, but it comes with a sort of caveat. In this case, I was invited to do a solo show at the museum, and I was going to be given the space next to Laddie John Dill, who, if you're familiar with the light and space movement, is a really important artist that went to Chouinard, and who I had really admired and had always wanted to show with. So I said, yes, absolutely. And, I would love to show next to Laddie and have my work in conversation with his work. But the catch was that I had to show in a hallway space that was long and narrow with a window at the end. So the very first thing I thought was, well, if it's a show, or at least the museum is focusing on light and space, this hallway has one really great advantage, which is this beautiful window at the end that creates a guiding light that can kind of guide you through the entire exhibition. And it will draw you to the end of that space. So my thought was, if I'm given this sort of interstitial space, this space in between other spaces, people are either going to pass through it quickly, or I can ask them to engage with the work by giving them visual cues that they're supposed to stop and linger in this space. So one of the ways I did that was to construct these octograms, which are these 8-pointed stars that both went above your head. So you had to walk through an archway of octograms. And then you also had to go all the way down to the end to sort of interact with this piece that really changed depending on the time of day because it filtered the light in the space. I was reading about how architects often will utilize window screens or devices to break up a room so that the shading and the light in the room feels more organic, because as human beings, we're used to being in spaces that are filtered, where light is filtered by trees and different things in our environment. And so when you're in an artificially lit space, it feels really strange. But if you can filter the light in some way with organic shapes, or with breaking it up with shapes, that it creates a warmth within the space that's inherently appealing. And so that was really important to me, was to create a space within a hallway where you would want to linger as a viewer. But this is just a really beautiful shot of the installation itself. Let's take a look at some of the paintings, and you can see. So this is most recent at the top, and then it goes down to the past. I'm going to scroll down here to the past. Let's see. The first work that I really had the opportunity to have people write about, or was recognized in Los Angeles, was this work that looks like this. So it's primarily diamonds, these large diamond paintings. Oops, is it not loading now? Oh yeah, it's just loading slow. This is the title of the piece is "When I Look Into My Ring, It Gives Me the Strangest Feeling for Beauty," after Elizabeth Taylor. And this is a portrait of Elizabeth Taylor's Krups diamond. And at the time I was making this work, I was fascinated with the sacred geometry that was inherent in gem coding and gem design. And I was interested in how American it was, particularly for someone to look at something as organically beautiful as a diamond or a crystal form and think, I could do better than that. And there's something about that I thought embodied the hubris of being an artist, and particularly an American artist. I think because my father is Greek and my mother is Slovakian, I grew up in a family where I was very aware that in order to sort of integrate into American society, I had to be studying American culture because my parents did. And so, one of the things that I think was really important to my dad was, attaining the hallmarks of American success and American culture. And one of them was buying my mother a diamond. And when my mother died, I inherited that diamond. And so it became a talisman for me. It was the only thing I got after she died. It was the only thing that was willed to me, but it was this precious thing that I kept with me. So I thought the diamond was a really great symbol of American culture, and then also faith and hope, and sort of all of the investment that we place in each other, right? But it also has underneath it this really sordid story. And so for me, the fascination, and one of the things, if you know any Greek people, we do this all the time, is the story behind the symbolism of the diamond as a marriage, as a symbol of marriage, goes back to the idea of tying your wife down to a rock. So it's a symbol for oppression, the idea that you're owned by somebody. And the story goes that Sisyphus was ultimately freed from his bondage, and he was given one link of his chain, which was he was allowed to give to his wife in order so that she would know that she belonged to him. And so for me, the diamond as an image is fraught with both positive and negative associations that have to do with feminism and ownership of the body, but also success in American culture. So I'm often interested in things that bring to mind these very opposite ideas, and looking for symbols of that, looking for objects that can operate as both beautiful abstract paintings, but then also have content embedded in them because there are stories behind those objects, behind those motifs. Let's see. This was one of the very first ones I made in 2011. And so I have a terrible, like low res photo of it, but it was really a breakthrough for me. And, I was also thinking about how important the complexity of this space was, just to fill it up, fill it up, fill it up. So, so like a mirror to her face after Ray Bradbury. And this is when I started also using these really elaborate naming conventions for paintings that dealt with literary text, and thinking of naming of the artwork as another place to be creative, that was different than just the space of the painting, that the painting also had a story behind it, and that the story could have a life. Let's see, I'm gonna go back this way. Let me go backwards. So in the last sort of big exhibition I had was in 2018, 17, 18, I was making work towards that. So I had a big exhibition that featured mostly the diamonds in 2011, which was very successful for me. And then I went into what I would describe as like an existential funk, where I was really nervous that I was only being asked to make that. And it made me feel really insecure about the content and theme in my work. And then right after that show, my father died. And so I went into like a space of mourning. So it took me a while to come back, but I just kept making work through it. And when I was making work, I was sort of making these small individual 12 by 12 inch paintings that referred to the geometry of the diamonds, but expanded on it. This is a good example of a transitional piece that I was sort of finding out what I wanted to make. And I started looking at quilt forms and thinking about the tradition of sewing within my family's cultures, within Greek culture, within American culture also, and trying to stitch together those two very different ideas. And you can see that as well. This one's called 8-Pointed Eye. So my only rule for myself when I was making these works was to deal with the number 8. So everything is, so that the underlying structure of the painting deals with the number 8. And that is because it's one of the simplest quilt block forms, but it also becomes the symbol of lots of sacred geometry ideas, because it's the symbol of infinity, which is, I knew going in, and it was very straightforward for me. And I wanted something that was a focusing device that was very straightforward and easy to understand so that I could repeat. And for me, a lot of making work is about repetition and allowing the process to teach me what it's about. And so creating a process for myself with a few imposed rules that allow me to repeat over and over and over again within variation. And inevitably, the work changes dramatically because within repetition, there becomes variety. And it's just the human nature to always implement variety. So this is really a transitional piece because it refers to a lot of the methodology that's in the diamond paintings. It's using the same materials, which is acrylic airbrush on canvas over panel. I started using airbrush when I was in grad school. I was working in a building that my studio was right next to the ROTC building at WashU when I was in graduate school there. And I was fascinated by this sort of all of these soldiers and military people going in and out of the building right behind my studio. And then all of these, queer artists and performance artists, there were all these events and things happening on the other side in the grad studios. And the two sides never really mixed, but my studio had a shared wall. So I could actually hear what was happening on the other side, and they could hear what was happening on my side. And so I had this, I was in this really strange space. And I started to think about that. What were some of the things that we thought of as, symbols or icons of masculine power, because the military seemed to be that to me at the time. And so at that time, I picked up an acrylic airbrush, mostly because they were being thrown away from the graphic design program. No one was using airbrush anymore. Airbrush was a graphic designer's tool, and it was something that was being, was sort of outmoded. Everybody was completely going digital, and all of this old, transfer paper, things like that were previously used in graphic design were being thrown away. So it was cheap and easy material. And it seemed to me to be a referent of masculine power because of car culture. And so I started playing with that. And that has become my material of choice, all the history behind it, the connection to the artists in Los Angeles who used the airbrush first as a graphic arts tool, and then also as a fine arts tool, artists like Billy L. Bankston, Ed Ruscha, and most specifically Judy Chicago, who I found personally very inspiring to me. And one of the things that Judy talked about a lot was, taking that, owning that, those products or those icons of masculine power, and then reinterpreting them. And so she had a relationship with her teacher, Billy L. Bankston, where he was using an airbrush, so she picked it up to show him she could do it too. And I thought that was a wonderful, tense story and an interesting story because of, her rise to fame as an artist, was that she did things like that. She became confrontational with her choices in materials, and she pushed the issue, she pushed the topic. And so I think of her as kind of, even though I know that she's an incredibly divisive figure within even feminism and art in general, I find her contrariness to be really insightful and interesting for me personally in the studio as a motivating agent. This is Rainbow Star Square. So a lot of the images started out as this sort of 8-point star. And then I started to implement and add the auras that go around the outside. So if you look at the halos that show up a lot, that's one of the wonderful things one of the wonderful qualities of airbrush is that it has this light and glow to it. And I was really fascinated with that and playing with that in the spectral color. This is Twisted Star Tunnel. These are all, again, based on quilts, and this is from 2017. So as I started making variations and looking at different quilt designers, looking at different fragments, they got wilder in terms of color. The format became pretty solidified as square, 30 by 30, 36 by 36. You'll see that I was using squares a lot because of that 8-point geometry that was underneath everything else. This 8-point polyphony. And so you can see that 5-point stars go around the outside edge, and then you have the major 4-point star, and then the 8-point star kind of emerges slowly as you look at it. It's underlying everything else, but it becomes almost invisible because of all of the busyness in the center. Okay, and then at some point when I was making this work in 2018, or probably, I don't know if it was 18 or the year before, but right around this time, my mentor from graduate school, Sabina Ott, died. And I was able to talk to her a lot while she was going through sort of her end stages of life on the phone. And I got to visit with her before she died. My mother died when I was a very young child. She got sick when I was 8 and then died at 10. And so I was raised by a single dad. But my teachers especially my female teachers, became this lifeline to feminine energy for me because I didn't have anything like that at home. And so, I became really close. I'm still friends with my middle school art teacher. I'm still friends with many of, with my high school English teacher. I'm still friends with many of my female painting instructors because they provided me with that sort of safe space in order to make my work. And my mother was also an artist who was frustrated. She took photographs and sort of made work on the side in between taking care of kids and running a business with my dad. But it was something that she always really wanted for me. So when Sabina was dying, we were talking about the work, and she said to me, right as she was dying, what would happen if you threw these images into space? What if they broke apart like I'm breaking apart? And she talked about dying as being this breaking apart of the body that was flying out into space to become part of the cosmos. And she was in this really interesting space before she died, where she was starting to talk about the dissolving of the body. And I thought it was just some of the most powerful conversation I've ever had. And it was really moving to me and emotional. And I thought, that's fascinating. What would happen if I took my work and I threw it into space and rotated it? And so I started researching and looking at, different computer programs that do that, and then working with digital media in order to animate the paintings and actually make them look like they're moving. So a lot of the method and technique I use goes between digital and analog. So there'll be a digital phase and then an analog phase where everything is painted by hand. And so there's a combination of things happening there. I'm still looking for, especially specifically in this particular series of works, I was still looking for maintaining the look of that octagram, which is the 8-point star is always referred to in the imagery, but then rotating it, twisting it in space and helping it feel like it's tumbling. So all of the work I think that I make deals with in some way passage and sort of light and space issues. So issues of wanting to make the paintings feel like they're moving through your body, wanting to make the paintings feel like you're actually engaging within a sacred space, but within the language of abstract painting. And this is in Inanna's Star Tunnel. I was also looking at and reading a lot about architecture in the ancient world and thinking about, because all of these 8-point star symbols come from different temple motifs, a lot of them, in a lot of the folk art that I'm looking at, that's both Greek, Sumerian, Slovakian, there are traditional handcrafts and materials that are religious iconography, but then also homemade things that women make to decorate their homes. And my grandmothers on both sides did that. They made hand lace and they made quilts and they made macrame hangings, you name it, anything that was sort of an activity that you could do with your hands that had a geometric underlying form and like textile work. And so I was always fascinated with that kind of handwork because I was around me all the time. And there's a fascinating tradition of that within both cultural sides of my family. And so as I was looking at these traditions, I could trace back some of the images and they just kept going farther and farther and farther back. And as I was looking at some of these images, I realized that the 8-point star as a motif is, really goes all the way back to some of the ancient temple forms in Sumerian architecture, specifically the temples that were built to the goddess Nana and the goddess Inanna. And so these ancient Sumerians used a ziggurat temple form, and then they used these 8-point stars to decorate the motifs. And the 8-point star is a symbol of the goddess Inanna, who was an amazing, like a sort of archetypal character who became Artemis in Greece, became Bridget in Ireland. She's the sort of archetypal female goddess. But what I found fascinating about that time period in those temple forms is that at that time, at least within the mythology of the culture, women had real power. So the poet Enheduanna, who wrote about Inanna, was actually the first recorded poet in human history. So her temple, so she was a scribe, so she was able to write, and she codified all of the temple ceremony into books and clay tablets that they were then distributed throughout all of Assyria and Samaria. And she became sort of like the first blockbuster author in history, which is kind of amazing to think about. So you're talking 500 years before the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I found just riveting and fascinating. That I had never heard about this goddess. I didn't know anything about Enheduanna the poet was shocking to me because it was just a cultural history that was completely lost to me. As a Greek person, so many ancient Greek temple sites are built on the foundations of much more ancient female goddess sites. And if you think about, sites like Ephesus, where there was temple of Artemis now, but underneath Ephesus, there was also an ancient temple structure. And so that's fascinating to me, how women are literally buried in the foundation. And then a lot of Inanna's cultural symbolism deals with queer space also. So Inanna was a goddess who could change gender. And so there are also gods and goddesses like that in Greek mythology that are able to transform between woman and man and live in that interstitial space. And I thought that's fascinating to me as a person who's never felt like they quite fit. And that feeling of I don't quite fit, this space isn't for me, stems a lot from growing up in a very patriarchal tradition in the Greek Orthodox Church. It's a twisted star tunnel. So my paintings are always designed to be looked at in a meditative space. So you can appreciate them aesthetically as simply abstract paintings. You can also use them as objects of meditation, which to me, there's not really much of a line between an object of meditation and a painting. Like, so an object of meditation, I can look at our Mark Rothko painting at Mocha, for example, for hours. It does, and just sit there and be with it. And I can spend my time meditating and relaxing, looking at that painting. And I want to facilitate that experience for a viewer so that they feel like they can move through the space and the space is moving through them as they're looking. Ruby Star Tunnel. A little faster. And then you can see, like, as they become more animated and start to twist and turn in space, they get just trippier and trippier as they go. The color gets more sort of acidic. Star of Inanna. This one's, 2016. This was even earlier. This is like the very first one. This should have been at the very end, the very beginning, but it's interesting to see how far they've come. Hex Halo. And love the 2018, this was actually when Sabina died. So I stopped this painting the day that she died, and I was working on it and talking to her on the phone. And that was my end point, was just to stop it, to mark her passage. And so I always think of it as her painting. And she was a big fan of Gertrude Stein, and if you're ever read any of Gertrude Stein's poetry, she uses a lot of repetitive phrasing in her work to invoke a spiritual space or to invoke meditation. And Sabina's work always referred to, in some ways, meditation as well. And she often used the line from Stein's work, a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. And that was fascinating to me, because in reading that, it does change you to read that. It does change you to repeat the phrase until the words become meaningless and sort of disintegrate. And so that meditation on language and how it relates to the meditation and painting was as fascinating to her as it is to me. And I think that's one of the reasons I sought her out as a mentor. So when I was in undergraduate school, finishing up, I basically applied to Anderson Ranch in Colorado to take a class with Sabina. And I drove out there during summer school and, in my pickup truck, and spent the summer basically learning in this one class from her and talking to her. And she had us reading all of these amazing, stories of tales of transformation, Rilke. She had us reading Goethe and talking about these spaces, these transformative spaces. And it really made a strong impression on me. And I thought, okay, I'm like in love with this professor. This woman is an amazing woman. I wanted to do anything to be near her. So I basically made a commitment at that point to travel to wherever she was teaching to go study with her. And at that time it was at Art Center. And so I was all psyched to go and to apply to graduate school at Art Center. And then she moved from Art Center to St. Louis and became a professor of art at Washington University in St. Louis. So that is where I wound up going to grad school, because I followed her. And I became her studio assistant and worked in her studio for a while and learned how she made things and her process. And then she became a lifelong friend and mentor, and really almost like a mother replacement, although she would be, she never ever liked to hear that term art mom referred to her. She didn't like that, because she said that's something that is extremely gendered, that we don't do to male instructors. We just call them, experts and masters. We don't refer to them as mom or dad. And it's true. I never thought about that before, but she was, for me anyway, just really a spiritual center and somebody who gave me a lot of confidence in talking about my work. Rotating star study. So lots and lots of versions of the same things, but permutations of those things. She is animated Rosetta. Her heart explodes after Sabina Ott, which I thought this was a really interesting image, because the polytope itself looks like it's sort of bursting out from the center. And she always had this long scar down her chest, after her surgery. She had surgery on her lungs, and it looked like it was right at her heart center, which I thought was sort of appropriate. She did have a tremendously big heart. Her rosettes burst open after Sabina Ott. And so now we're getting into the work that went into that show that was at Lancaster Museum of Art and History. So within that show, I wanted people to really stare at these paintings. And I thought, how do you get people to stare at a painting in a hallway? Like, nobody stops in a hallway to stay for any length of time. They blast through it as quickly as possible. And so using the window device to get people to slow and stop was one of the key things. So in front of the paintings, in order to get people to concentrate, you had to sort of duck under the octahedrons in order to get in to the space itself. This is Snake in the Mist. 2019. This is a variation on quilt form and playing with the optics of the quilt form and the optics of the pattern itself. She is in the Radiant Light to 2019. So when I was preparing for the show at Lancaster Museum, I was like, okay, I'm making this work. I know it's based on the 8-point star. I know it's based on the principles of light and space, and wanting to create that spatial relationship and, you know, have it be an ambiguous queer and feminine space, so that it felt like the temple to the goddess that I wanted to worship, instead of the goddess or the god of my father's religion, which was Orthodoxy. But being raised as an Orthodox Christian in that sacred space, you know, it is a beautiful sacred space to be in. So to be in a room that is covered with paintings and mosaics, to have light filtered from a dome, and to be sitting in that golden light and hearing vespers or hearing meditation, you know, hearing psalms and hymns, Gregorian chants, is incredibly beautiful. And I love that part of my childhood. And I want to evoke that space, but I want to have that space happen in the museum. I want to have that space happen in a way that addresses people like me, so that people can have that same experience without feeling shut out. When I was a kid, I asked my father if I could be an altar boy, which it didn't even occur to me at the time that the boy was in the term. And he said, you know, you can't, you can ask the priest, but he's going to tell you can't go up behind the altar. And I asked him why, and he said, well, because, you know, he said, you have the Father explain it to you. And so the priest explained to me that it was because women's bodies are thought to pollute the altar space. So there's an iconostasis, that's a screen that covers the front of the altar, and women are not allowed to walk behind that screen. Only men are allowed to walk behind that screen. And I remember looking at him and looking at my dad and saying, why on earth would I ever go to, why would I'm asking to do something that no kid wants to do. Like, no kid wants to wake up early on Sunday and, you know, parade through the church and shake incense around. I really want to be in this space. I love this space. It makes me feel connected to my mother. It makes me feel connected in prayer to other people and to the universe. And you're telling me I can't go there because I'm polluted, and I'm actually 12 and haven't gotten my period yet, and I don't know what you're talking about. That's gross and weird, and I don't like that. So a lot of me in the work I make, and as I'm revisiting it over and over again over time, I realize I'm just kind of constantly repeating that defiantly, that I want to create this radiant light space for people like me, you know. And so I wrote some notes about that specific idea, but it's pretty simple. Most depriving temples in the ancient world are exclusively masculine, both in name and iconography. My paintings utilize the language of light and space, sacred architecture, and textile forms to create a queer, feminist, divergent, ambiguous space, the spaces that I believe are no less sacred. And I think that that's really important. I think that we all need that sacred space for ourselves, especially right now. She gathers the me in radiant light. So the idea of having, you know, if, you know, a sort of goddess form that motivates your action, that you can project yourself into as basically a focus of meditation, is super important to me. And I think that it's helped me grow as an artist and grow also in as a human being. And it's definitely helped reduce my anxiety during COVID to have these images that are images of relaxation and meditation. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I sat in front of a painting and meditated every day. And while I was sitting in front of that painting, I consciously tried to visualize holding my baby in an art show situation, because I wanted to make sure that I could bring my child into my creative life, that I didn't have to make a choice between my child and my creative life. And that's because a lot of people told me that you couldn't do both things. And probably most notoriously, Dave Hickey told me when he was doing a studio visit with me, the best advice he had to give me was never to get married and never to have kids. And I remember thinking, you're not looking at my work, you know? And then he tried to talk me into going to graduate school at UNLV. So I knew he liked my work, but he didn't want to talk about my work. He wanted to talk about how women damage their careers by having children and husbands. And I thought, why do we believe that? Why do we believe that our lives have to be separate, that we can't have a personal life and still be an artist that's engaged with our practice? So I tried to combat that by actually really actively visualizing my daughter in that space with me. And it really helped me get through, I think, what was a kind of a malaise. Sailor Venus. And so sometimes there are references to things that she's interested in or that she was interested in as a child, you know, so Sailor Moon was what she was interested in at the time. but the icons of all those characters are named after some of them goddesses, in this case, Venus. And this is a nice shot of the window at the end of that space, which really did, a lot of the interference paint that's in the painting sort of is activated by light as well. So they sort of looks like it's glimmering or flashing. And it changes and activates the space around you so that you could come in and meditate. And I talked to all of the docents that were there and people that were guards in this space. And I said, please tell people that it's okay to stand in front of the artwork for a long time if they want to come during lunch and meditate. It's designed to be a meditation space. Always keep a stool here if somebody wants one to pull in front of the painting, and talk to them about it. Tell them that this is a good place to stand. And so people did come up to me when I was in the gallery space to tell me about what their experience was like. And one guard was just so excited to meet me because she said that she had an out-of-body experience standing in front of one of the pieces, and she hadn't expected it. And she was really just moved and floored and wanted to know more about some of the imagery in the work and then some of the references to sacred geometry. This is another shot of the hallway. It really was a hallway space because you can see like the fire alarm in the corner and stuff. But sometimes those spaces give you unique opportunities. And so because your brain has to solve the problem in a different way, you have to move on and try to incorporate and creatively fold that problem into your practice. And so being an artist means that no matter what happens in your life, you have to creatively solve the problem in order to do it the way that an artist would. It's the way that you would do it. And so another really wonderful piece of advice that a professor gave me was Buzz Spector, who is a very famous book artist and does book installation artwork, and is very influenced by Brutathers and really interesting conceptual artist. He said to me, every single thing you send out to the world has to be made by you as an artist. And you should think about that every time you send a letter or a correspondence or even an email. Do it creatively. And people, be yourself, always be yourself, always try to refer back to it and do, in your own way, in your own language. And so correspondences and the way that things are phrased and named, I think I'm really, really influenced by him because his work was always so steeped in theory. And a lot of the clues to interpreting his work were in the titling. So that's fascinating to me. This is the beginning of the shift in my work in 2021, 2020. I think that like lots of people dealing with the pandemic, it completely rocked my world, and all of a sudden everything that I was making didn't feel like it was right anymore, and I had to start again. And so I remember starting from this just very simple place, which was drawing this sort of repetitive textile form, the grid that's underneath, which is sort of the wire form that people use to sew and embroider with. And then noticing that form looked a lot like a pyramid. And that the pyramids also, if stacked and turned, became dimensional and became other things, became motifs of the body, passages within the body. They became very yonic or phallic. And I was fascinated by how something as simple as a stacked weave could become so many other things. And so I just kept trying. And it was like, I think it had the same fascination for me as the polytopes, which are those really complicated 3D forms, in that it was like a problem that I could pick apart and solve over time. And it was very tedious and took a long time. And so it gave me hours and hours of meditative practice when I most needed it, which was, during in the last 2 years during quarantine. I think I was just, needed the relaxation that repetitive action gave me. And so for me, repetitive action, I do find very soothing. And to some people, it just creates more anxiety. And in some levels, when I see the beginning of the work and I think about how much I have to do, if I focus on that, it does give me anxiety. But if I focus on the incremental step by step, and anything that's quantifiable with numbers, to me, reduces my anxiety. So it just helped me a lot to think about building the painting as this textile grid that was building out from the center. And that within that simple temple form or that simple textile form, you could create these incredible spatial passages by just varying it slightly, varying the curvature, varying the steps, varying the color, and playing with that. So these are all based on our Bargello Italian textile designs. And so my family is, or my father's family is from an island, Zakynthos, which is in Greece. And it's in between Ionia, or it's in between ancient Ionia and ancient Italy. So At one point, and many times actually over history, the island itself was considered part of Venice, was considered an Italian island. And then at other times it was considered a Greek island, and it's been occupied by Italy many times, including during World War II, which is when my father was a young boy. But many of the handcrafts and names of things on the island are in Italian and Greek. So my last name Pomona, or Pomonis, actually is an Italian goddess, Pomona. And so everyone on the island has the same last name. And that's because everybody on the island was a feudal serf of the duchy, the Duke of Pomona. So it became this thing that ties everybody. If you ever meet another Pomonis, they have a family member that's from the same island that my family's from, because it's a very unusual Greek name. It's not a common Greek name because it has that Italian base in it. So what was fascinating to me, though, is if you ask people in the island or on the island about the goddess Pomona and, where does the name come from? Where was the cult of Pomona? They don't know anything about it. They know about the Greek Orthodox Church, and they can tell you about the history behind the Greek Orthodox Church, but they can't tell you what came before, and they don't really remember any of it because it's been so smashed by patriarchy. It just doesn't exist anymore. But there is evidence within the language and story traditions of the island and within the islanders themselves. So, there's the Artemis Eleutheria, who's the goddess of the mountain, or called the tall woman on the mountain. And people there used to leave offerings to the mountain for childbirth. And so those sort of mysterious stories still exist. And then there is also the story of the goddess Pomona herself, who was seduced by Autumnus, who transformed himself into a woman so he could get to know and get close to Pomona, because she was afraid of men. So she was a virgin goddess, a lot like Artemis, and she stayed away from men and stayed in the forest and was considered the goddess of the fruit of the tree. So they fell in love with each other, but they fell in love with each other as women, not as a woman and a man. And so he transformed. So what happens is they kiss as both women, and then Autumnus transforms himself into a man and reveals his true identity, which is a masculine identity, but also very non-binary, because the love story is one that's a transformative one. And so that's always fascinating to me, that even is something as simple as the language and the influence, the stories behind them are often the connecting piece that is what you don't see. Like, why am I fascinated with Italian Bargello designs? Well, I think I'm fascinated with them because there's some evidence in the place that I'm from, or that my family's from, of this design work everywhere. And it's just never been named to me as having a tradition that goes back to Venice, but it does. And that's fascinating to me. This is a Bargello mandorla, which the mandorla is the shape that's around the Pantailla, who's the Mother Mary image. And you often see her in this sort of flaming mandorla form, which is like a vaginal shaped halo. And in the Bargello design, you see that flame mandorla pattern a lot. Isis Anima. This was also made during the pandemic. I made a series of these shapes works to sell at auction to support basically people who were unemployed during the pandemic, because a lot of artists were unemployed. And the gallery that I show with in Chicago, Seer, had a big fundraiser, and I sold a lot of these smaller shaped works as objects of meditation. And I became really fascinated with working with these shaped forms. I had done the octagon forms before, but the octagram form, which is the two intersecting squares that creates that dynamic star, in its relationship to the Middle East, I thought was fascinating. And I was really, really interested in the idea of Isis Anima, which, the goddess Isis has always been really interesting to me, but creating sort of breath of the goddess. And so Isis's story is that she breathes life into her son. Zabalam Temple. This one, you can see the shape of the triangle is influencing the space of the way that you interact with the painting. So you interact with the painting. It has a relationship between the spatial dynamics of perspective, and then also the spatial dynamics of just the color itself. So the background is interference paint, so it changes color as it goes, and it's iridescent. So it iridesces and moves sort of as you look at it. It has a flickering effect. And then the polytope in the center feels like it's popping out at you. But then if you look at it, because it's a triangle within a triangle, your mind kind of turns it into a frame around the central triangle. And so your eye gets into all these weird spaces. And when I've been making these latest pieces that are based on that temple form, which is the pyramid form. I'm really interested in the beginning of that pyramid form, as it exists in many different ways. So as it exists as an operating device within textiles, and then as it exists as an operating device within architecture itself, as she drew her breath. This to me looked like lungs. And again, I was making work during the pandemic and thinking about breathing and life. And then the metaphor of the airbrush is breathing. A flower snake cushion for my lady. So I started to make works that were more specifically about textiles and thinking about decorating or finishing architectural surfaces with pattern and decoration, and thinking about, okay, well, I've always been trying to evoke this feeling of being within a feminist sacred space. How would I do that? What would the fabrics look like? What would the chairs look like? What would all of the surface how could I think about decorating that space and bringing that space to life? And this was thinking about a pattern for a top of a cushion. It was in a show called Garden at Annie Wharton. The Ladies Room Los Angeles is the name of Annie's gallery now. And I thought it was fascinating that the name of the gallery itself, the Ladies Room, was also the name of one of the poems of Enheduanna, describing about this sacred space, the safe space, or the Gitbar, the women's room, ladies' room, that is supposed to be a safe space for women, and then people who identify as non-binary. So within the temple structure, there were both priests and priestesses, but inside the poetry, she talks a lot, and Enheduanna talks about the power of woman to become man and man to become woman, that there's a collapsing of that binary within that space, and that's the whole purpose of the space, because Inanna is the goddess of sex and transformation. And so I wanted to make a sacred space that dealt with both sex and transformation, and thought about that is a visual passage. This is a temple for Tiresias, another really fascinating story. There's a fascinating story. Tiresias is one of the gods that worked as a temple prostitute and he was transformed into the shape of a woman so that he could have the experience of being a woman and then transform back into a man. And while he was a woman, he worked as a temple prostitute. And so inside mythology, there are all these stories of non-binary people and stories of queer people that have often been just sort of pushed to the background so that we can hear more traditional stories like Leda and the Swan, which are really stories of rape. They're not stories of pleasure. And I think that that's really sad. And it's one of the things I'm always struggling with as part of my cultural identity, is that I'm come from one of the most destructive and original colonial powers. I mean, some of the first laws about restricting women's bodies come through Greek text, because the Athenians wrote everything down. So, for example, there's an ancient Greek law about the status of woman after rape, and essentially, if a woman, because she's considered to be property and listed as part of her father's inheritance, if someone violates her in some way, then she can be awarded as property to the violator as restitution to her father. Stories like that bring me a lot of shame as a Greek person, but also make me defiant and want to look for stories that do the opposite of that, that instead of limit and restricting the role of women, that liberate them or that talk about female pleasure. Finish it in splendor after Enheduanna. And again, thinking about decorating that women's room and thinking about what finishing means. So to finish something is to surface it and to make it beautiful. And then thinking about the temple forms and wanting to create finished and beautiful forms, but also the metaphor of sex, of finishing, and thinking about creating feminine sacred stories of pleasure instead of oppression. And finish it in lace after Enheduanna. And then the one I just finished is behind me because I haven't updated my website with the most recent painting. But that's, you kind of get a sense of what size they are. And there, again, I've stuck with that 36 by 36 or 30 by 30 dimension, because it's been really, I think, there's something very stabilizing about using the same format and then repeating a lot. This piece was in a show at Melissa Morgan Fine Art, and then a couple of the other pieces were recently in a show, Good Vibrations, at Intersect Palm Springs, that was curated by Shannonese Dimbrot and Hunter DeWorka and Phillips, who's an amazing art critic. They're both amazing art critics. One writes for the LA Weekly and one writes for the LA Times. Let's see. So how did I get to know art critics? That's a good question. Somebody should ask me that. Before I really started or had my first show in Los Angeles, in order to get studio visits, I'm just going to scroll through drawings because while I'm talking, I started to work and think about how to get my work out there, because I moved to Los Angeles from St. Louis and I didn't know anybody. And one of the best pieces of advice is I stood up in a panel discussion and I asked Alexis Smith, who's a very famous feminist artist, what should I do? I said, basically it feels like it's a boys club in LA. Everybody went to who's at his show at the Hammer right now, or everybody's in the shows at the Hammer, either went to CalArts or UCLA. I didn't go to those schools. What should I do? And her advice to me was to create a scene and learn to do something that nobody else wanted to do. And I thought that was wonderful advice. And I immediately said, okay, I'm going to start being a curator. And actually, Christopher Knight walked up to me, who's a critic for the LA Times, afterwards and said, he thanks me for asking the question and for making everybody very nervous, because he said those are important questions to ask. And he advised me he said, you're very articulate, you should be a writer. And so I thought, okay, I'm a writer too, I can be a writer. So I started writing about different artists' work and then asking for studio visits. And I found out and discovered that artists don't like writing about their work. And so if you come to them with an offer of writing about their work and doing a studio visit, that they will often say yes. And that's in the process of saying yes, people open themselves up to you, and that it leads to more yeses over and over again, which is a wonderful, energetic change. And so that process really taught me how to do a lot of things for myself, like how to put together a press release for myself, what it felt like to be in the position of the critic or writer, and to say thank you to people for writing, because a lot of artists don't do that. They don't thank critics and curators for writing about their work. And this relationship you have with what the work means in the world and yourself, and then also what the work means in the world to people other than yourself, is such an important relationship. And if you go into that relationship with other people, giving of yourself, and you will receive so much. And that's such a basic idea, basic principle, but it was really transformative for me. So I always think about her, and she told me to create a scene, and that has influenced so much of what my practice has become. I'm going to skip forward to collaboration here. This is a meeting of the Association of Historic Curators. That's Kim Abele sitting, and we're in a studio visit with her. The Association of Historic Curators is a social practice group, which is basically a collaborative feminist community where we meet to discuss different ideas that are basically show concepts that are interesting to us. And then we try to curate those shows and then find a location for them, go approach galleries and say, we have a show with 30 artists in it, would you like to have this show or present this show? It's about this topic and this theme. And the topic and the themes of the show always come out of consciousness raising events. So we meet and we have conversations and we talk about what's important to us. And so our most recent event, or our most recent show, is My Body, My Truth, which very much came as a response to issues of body autonomy, a lot of the anti-trans youth legislation, and a lot of the, I think the erosion of female agency over the body by law in the United States, in many, many states. And so we wanted to create a show that talked about how really the issues of body autonomy, if you look back at the history of colonialism, that the idea that you can own someone's body, that you can own a slave, or that you can own a woman, that both of those evils, or sort of that idea of ownership, really stem from the issues of control over the body and people feeling entitled to their body, and that they're vestiges of colonial control. That there's so much legislation aimed at women's bodies and not aimed at men's bodies in this country. And so we wanted to talk about, how there was an intersection of purpose with both feminist communities and trans communities and Black communities in this country, because we're all fighting these same vestiges of colonial oppression. So we wanted to create a show that talked about all of those things at the same time. And then the title of the show is My Body, My Truth. We did an open call, and we approached specific artists that we really liked and said, would you please be in this show? And one of the artists I approached right away was Rosalind Miles. And I just love this piece, Openings. And you can see within the teardrops, you have different faces almost looking like they're looking through the bars of a cell, and then also looking through, like a birth image, an image of a vagina, and also an image of a teardrop. So to me, it's about beauty and pain at the same time in the history, and then conflation of those two different ideas of oppression, and also liberation. Beautiful. This is an image by Alison Peary, Target Practice, which became the show card image for us. This is Amy Talman's. image. Cindy Rame's eye body. This is a gorgeous image. These are all, she makes beautiful zine collages and hand stitched things. And then My Body, My Choice, Her Body, Her Choice by Andrea Bowers, which this is also another example of, if you write to people and ask them to help you, sometimes they just say yes. And so I wrote a cold call email to Andrea Bowers, who's a feminist artist that I really admire, and asked her to basically donate her work to the show or to participate in this show. And she said yes, and the show has traveled now, and the piece has traveled with it. But I feel so grateful to her for letting us show the work, and letting us into her feminist collaborative space, because she is such a famous and successful artist. And that's sort of what our group's about. We were founded to help make transparent to each other what are some of the vestiges of success in the art world, the things that people don't tell you how to do. How to write a press release, how to apply for a college teaching position, how to approach a gallery for space, how to deal with maybe a curator who's being creepy or who's transphobic. Like, how do you deal with that? What do you do? How do you clap back? When is it safe to clap back, and when is it not safe to clap back? And we have conversations about that all the time, every other week. And it's been a wonderful support mechanism for me in my life. It started out because I had a curator tell me, after he invited me to be in a show in China, tell me that my work wasn't political enough because it was too personal, which just drove me bananas. And I started to think about who gets to decide how things are curated. Why is it always one person at the top of a pyramid? Why do we always have to have this hierarchy imposed? Can't we have a show that's curated in a more collaborative, not a linear way, or not a linear way, but a more collaborative, even way, so that there isn't one person dominating the whole conversation, that the show's ideas and themes shift. This is stacked by Zanaya Baltaji. It's a beautiful image. And then Untitled by Chitra Gopalas Krishnan. I'm probably butchering her last name, I apologize. I love Chitra's work. It's a beautiful piece in person. It's very, the surface is really delicate. And she's an artist from San Diego, so professor at San Diego State, Camilla Taylor. And this image I think is really interesting because she has a very specific abortion story tied to her childhood. She was sexually assaulted in her youth and got pregnant, and then was growing up in a community where basically abortion was illegal. And so she made pennyroyal tea, which is an aborticide, and actually performed her own non-medical abortion on herself. The Curl by Chloe Diaz, Domestic Goddess. And this was my piece, Lex Askion. So again, like, I'm always dealing with that sort of temple form, thinking about space for the body for woman. It's in the details. And so some of the artists in this show are first-time artists that have never shown before. So this is an artist who I believe is at Chapman University, and she applied for the open call. And our rule for this particular show was, as long as the work isn't racist, sexist, or homophobic, and it meets the theme, we're going to let it in. So we really want to be the first show that we want to be a space that's available to young artists to join for support as a mechanism. We are, basically open to anyone who identifies as a feminist. So it can be anyone who wants to participate, basically, as long as they meet the rules of the group, which is that we have some rules about nonviolent discussion and some rules about being appropriate with each other and what the boundaries are, so that we create a safe space for everyone. This is a really interesting photo series by an artist who is an alumni of Cal State Long Beach, and she's alumni from the photo program. And this is a photo documentary series she's doing about witches and potions. And so a lot of the women that she goes to visit to shoot photos of will often ask to have their identities cropped out, like their heads cropped out, because they don't want to be persecuted as women who believe in witchcraft. Let's go through these. Tani Featherston. Martin Lucas is a New York-based artist. Foil Face by Barbara Hashimoto. So each one of these images engages the body in a different way. And this is a couple, Ashley Hepburn and Tara Van Lintel, whose work I started following on Instagram. Tara is a photo and art dealer in Los Angeles, and this is her partner, Ashley, and they did this really fun photo documentary series of their relationship during COVID. Mi Cuerpo. This is Carolyn Castaño, who's just an amazing artist, who actually came in and gave a visiting artist lecture at CSULB, I think 4 years ago. She has a solo show that's up, Kali S. Kali at Pasadena City College, that's up right now. And she was also, this show was also at Okma 2 years ago. Vida Empieza, Life Begins by Alexis Garcia. This is just this little seedling. Bedroom by Tanya Hayden, which is just a magazine cover. There's a magazine that's been painted on, and just the feeling of exhaustion. I think that I really relate to this image because she was a mother, she has 2 boys, and she was trying to handle Zoom classes and teaching and dealing with all of the issues with trying to run a family during COVID was exhausting. And the image of sheer exhaustion, I think, is really evident in this work. She's also a really interesting musician, and she is one of the Hayden triplets. So if you like Dolly Parton or Loretta Lynn or any sort of like old time country music, because they're triplets, they have that amazing sort of polyphonic sound of the 3 different voices overlapping. That's just incredible to listen to. She's a really interesting artist. Boy Like You, A Girl Like Me by Mulatto Francine, also a really interesting artist who just finished a residency in Greece. By Sporia is Nicole Yang, is one of the instructors that I work with at Cal State Fullerton, who's in the illustration program, and who also teaches an art education like I do. Brainscape by Emma Hoodler. Bonded by Monica Lemon. She's from the Washington area. Palettes by Angelica Benalis, her grad show at Claremont Graduate University is opening right now, and I can't be there because I'm here today, but shout out to Angelica. She's actually also teaching an art education for us at Cal State Fullerton, and just a wonderful painter. Temple by Sydney Lewis. Sydney is a artist from Chicago who I greatly admire, and my dealer found or didn't discover, but she really liked her work, and she chose the same gallery that I do in Chicago. Meadow by Kathy Akers. And so then one of the nice things about having an open call too is you get a variety of responses to the theme. And so in some ways this is a torso show. So many torsos showed up, but the body and what the body means and all of its permutations really is different, is approached by photographers and painters, and the people approach it very differently depending on their practice versus a performance artist who's documenting a performance. There's and I think each one of those approaches is interesting to see with each other. And when you have a non-hierarchical structure like ours, you do see everything. It's more of a wider shot at the theme, which if you're a traditional curator who went to school and studied, somebody who's an accomplished curator, like Nitzan Shaked from your school or Matthew Sims, you're taught to sort of focus in on and to really reify the theme. And I think that that's valid and really important from an art historical perspective. But from our position as artists, we want to be in that creative space where we're breaking boundaries and sort of breaking rules. And maybe it's okay if we go down rabbit holes and deviate from the structure because it's an art project rather than thinking of it as a curatorial project. And that's partially why our name is inherently designed to make you laugh and also cringe at the same time. So Cannibalism by Diana Sofia Estrada. The USA Consumption, and that piece not for USA consumption that pairs with it. Diana Sofia is now in Houston, Texas. She's a really wonderful artist from CalArts. And Amanda Atkins, who's a Phoenix-based artist, and actually the show is in Phoenix right now at her space. And all of her work is about struggling with endometriosis. And, one of the difficulties of being, and I do not have endometriosis, but I've learned so much about about the illness because of her. There really isn't a great drug for endometriosis because there's no research money associated with it as an illness. It causes great pain in women's bodies, but it's not considered to be, life-threatening. So therefore there isn't a lot known about it. And so she's documented her struggle in a lot of these paintings. And the show itself is now in Phoenix at Cobra Flute Projects, which is a project space that she runs. It's actually her gallery. It's sort of she runs it as a project space and also as her studio space. And so that's kind of when people ask us how we get venues, a lot of times people show up and ask us, would you like to do something here? And we usually say yes. And we want to take advantage of every opportunity. But because we're a large group, our professional connections expand with each other. And so we also make an agreement as part of our, collaborative structure that we promote each other, that we don't just advertise for ourselves and we don't just push ourselves in the art world, we push each other. So we try to encourage each other to, to show up for each other for openings and events and also to promote on vehicles like Instagram. So that sounds really simple, except that as many of you may have experienced a critique, a lot of times we see as gathering in an art group is gathering together to criticize each other rather than gathering together to uplift. When you get out of art school, all of the safety and protection of art school is gone. And so you have to create that structure around yourself a lot of times to sustain your practice as an artist. And so you really want to surround yourself with people that are going to promote and protect you and help you, inspire you to make more work, not people who just cut you down and make you feel bad about your work. And it's hard to switch from that brain critique mode to a more supportive mechanism mode. And I think that having the group in place, even though it started out as a reaction to feeling oppressed, and wanting to create a non-hierarchical structure or club, a feminist consciousness raising group, it's turned into this very wonderful, loving experience for me as an artist and sustain my practice. And that was really obvious to me during quarantine, because we were still able to meet via Zoom. And so I had this network of friends that I never lost touch with because we met every 3 weeks, all during quarantine. Let's see. And then the other part of what I do is I work at Cal State Fullerton in the art education program, and I run a program called the Prison Arts Collective there, which is it's actually a California State program, and Annie Buckley founded it. It's Cal State San Bernardino. She's now at San Diego State University. And it came out of this interest that both, that she had really in the overlap between art education and social practice. And so it became a process for her to create these teaching opportunities for students in alternative spaces. So jobs for artists, young artists that wanted to work with community and wanted to do art projects with community. And she really pioneered and started that first program with an inmate, an incarcerated individual, Stan Hunter, who's now a teacher in that program. So when she asked me to bring that program to Cal State Fullerton, I said, yes, absolutely, that's wonderful. And then right after we started, the pandemic hit. And so during the pandemic, we created art learning packets that we sent, which were like correspondence course packets. My students wrote curriculum, and then we would look at the artwork and I would correspond with the individual artists. Now we're in person again. So we are at CIW, which is California Institution for Women in Chino, Corona. It's starting again. It's just a wonderful place. And one of the reasons I think art education is such an important and viable program is that if you're an artist trying to make your work in the world, having a community, especially a classroom community about you, can be a life-saving part of your life. So it gives you connection and meaning and relationships with others. And it's not just about yourself. And so often in art school, we're taught to go into our studio and to be alone and to be about the individual. And part of that is true in terms of wanting to come to your own sensibility and your own aesthetic, but it's also not true in the sense that you can't survive without connections to other people. And that in our society, the most horrible punishment we have for someone is a solitary confinement, it's isolation. So when we're telling you to go into the studio to be by yourself, in some way it can feel like a punishment if you don't have positive social interactions. And art education is a path to meaningful employment for so many young artists. I could not have, had a child and bought a house in Los Angeles, maintained a studio practice without my job as an art educator. And I'm so grateful to Dr. Gatlin and Dr. Trimble at LongBeach, who really saw potential in me and offered me a job. I left my job teaching high school to teach at Cal State LongBeach in 2016. And right after the election, it was my first full school year was 2017, 2018 there. And I had been part-timing at all these different colleges in the evening and still teaching high school during the day. And at my sort of most impacted semester, I was teaching 7 classes at the same time, 4 on campus at the high school, and then 3 at universities. And then they weren't the same universities either. They were 3 different schools. So CSUN, Cal State San Bernardino, and Cal State Long Beach. And then Dr. Gatlin set me down and said, would you like to quit your high school teaching job and come work here and teach 4 classes? And I said yes, which was a crazy thing to do because it was a huge pay cut. But it was really a wonderful move for me. And I can't say enough nice things about the art education program at Cal State Long Beach. It's the largest in the state of California, and in my opinion is the finest, even though I teach in a competitive program. I love Cal State Fullerton and I love the art credential program there. But I feel very loyal to Long Beach because it's where I started, and it's where I felt like just a tremendous collegial support by all of the instructors and faculty there, especially in ceramics. Because art ed in ceramics and fiber as well, shares that little corridor area where there was a lot of overlap. And so my students that were in art ed classes would also be in ceramics at the same time. And we had really positive interactions with all of the people in ceramics. And it was such a gift to be there teaching art education classes at the same time that, Ruby Neary was in the ceramic studio making large scale monumental ceramics work, and really working with some of the finest contemporary artists in America, making work in the ceramic studios. That was a super exciting time in my life. And I think of LongBeach as being really an iconic program for that reason, because you have all of these wonderful overlaps and creative spaces where people are working non-traditionally in their area, sort of breaking rules and boundaries and talking about and encouraging students to take those creative risks. And so I'm very, very loyal to LongBeach. I promote it a lot. And I really believe in the program. It also has, I think, one of the finest sculpture collections in the area, certainly at all of the Cal States that I've visited. And that's because of the history of the cultural community in Long Beach that promoted art, sculptural collaborations between industry and sculpture, which is fascinating to me. And that's what, Brian Trimble, Dr. Trimble is really interested in as well, is that collaboration between the community and of artists and the community of, engineers and workers who are making work together in a very modernist style. And so like that Claire Falkenstein sculpture that is a huge, beautiful fountain that's on campus is just gorgeous, just to be able to sit there and look at that every day, to see running water, and then to appreciate the vision of the university behind collecting work like that, or that you're sitting next to the student's door or walking down the hallway to the art office, and you're walking just by a tremendous piece of artwork. So there's artwork everywhere on campus there. And, I always try to think about that the environment and the ethos of the community around you can influence the products and the students and how well people do. As you're sitting on, and I always just see students sitting on the Robert Irwin all the time, which it looks like just like little cutout square in between the two pillars. Consider yourself really lucky to go to a university that has that much respect for working artists and contemporary artists, and then the vision to invest in them very heavily. And so there's a lot of vision behind the administration at Cal State Long Beach, and I'm very grateful to them for welcoming me in. And like I said, I would not be an assistant associate professor if I hadn't started there. And I feel really grateful to the staff, the faculty, for being very supportive of me, and then also being very supportive of me talking about art education in a very different way, which was community-based art education. Even though I worked within the credential program too, I've worked in both a public high school classroom and then out in the community. Those two parts of my practice are tremendously important to me because they give me sustenance. And then where there's the true overlap, I think, is here, which is Radical Actions, which is from teaching artists to social practice. And we publish articles and essays about artists who use social practice and basically art education methods in order to create projects for themselves. And so how do you work with community in ethical ways? How do you transform community and engage with community and do it with respect from within rather than imposing from on the outside? These are all issues that we talk about that are issues within the art education classroom, but there also are issues within the contemporary art social practice world. And if you look at artists that are doing that really and at the top of their game, they're constantly thinking of how to honor the participant. And essentially in an art ed classroom, the participant is the student. And so the difference is only in the way that we talk about it when it's in a museum versus in a classroom. But the actual creative action is the same. The person organizing the creative action is either the artist or the teacher. And so for me, it's say you're a teaching artist. There's no doubt about it that both halves of that phrase are part of my identity as a person. And I think that it's important. So, anyone can submit an essay or an article. And we really encourage social practice artists and art education majors or people who are interested in art ed and social practice to send articles into us and we publish them. So I'm ready for questions. I feel like I've talked till my point where my throat is sore. So it's been at least an hour, I think, hour and 15 minutes. So I'm open to questions if anybody has any.
Mariana, thank you so much. You are a force.
I'm trying to figure out what page to still on. Should I stop share? Probably. Let's see.
It's up to you. It's completely up to you.
There we go. I'm back.
You're back. You're back. Thank you so much for that. That was a just a feast visually and mentally. You are, yeah, as I mentioned, a force. Looking in the Q&A here, there's a great variety of questions, and most of these you have addressed and sort of touched on at least. But maybe I'll go through them, give you a chance to maybe expand upon them, or maybe repeat things in different ways, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
This first question came up right away, and this was in reference to the CV and the notion that we should be recording kind of everything that we do and keeping a great record of that. So I'll ask this question, but maybe you could expand more about how you use your CV as a tool. And, I'm sure I know there are students out there that are starting to form theirs and might not know what to include. So maybe you can walk us around that a little bit and some other thoughts that you have. So the question would be, and it was in reference to, collecting all these different events that you're in, gallery shows you're in. Would it be an issue if anybody asks and only wants to see recent stuff, or would it be good to still add and just explain if asked about it? So
right.
Well, I'll let you take it from there.
No one has ever asked me that question. So in other words, whenever I've submitted a 5-page CV, no one's ever said, can you cut it down to 1 page? So if the criteria is 1 page, then I only submit 1 page. If the criteria is your CV, you get it all. And so if anything, the reaction people have is, oh my God, how have you done all this stuff? Part of it is I'm old, like I've lived a long life. And so I've shown, several times a year, but I also think that I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder, which was I moved to a city where I didn't know anybody. And so in order for me to be successful as an artist, no one was going to give me the solo show in a gallery in Los Angeles out of grad school, because I didn't go to CalArts, I didn't go to UCLA, and I didn't go to Cal State Long Beach. So if you're looking around and you're looking at who the emerging artists are in the city that have gone to graduate school, they're dominated by several of the area graduate schools, and then nobody else. So if you have to come in, you have to come in swinging. You have to give the person who wants to give you a show a reason to include you. And so you have to be in some ways making up for that. And for me, it was just a full-on hustle. Now, full-on hustling was something I was taught to be embarrassed of. And I think for me, the thing that sort of flipped my switch and made me think of it as being something positive was I had a mentor, Carol Carumpus, who was a professor at Otis, and she was friends with Judy Chicago. And we were talking one time about how aggressive Judy was. And she said, oh, it was just so difficult to be around her. She was so aggressive. And I said, yeah, but like, if you open up any history of modern art textbook, you're going to find Judy Chicago. And so if you're waiting for somebody to write the book about you, you might be waiting your entire life. Or you can write the book about yourself and get through the part where it's super embarrassing and people snub you, and then realize that that book has a life outside of you, and that people who discover your work through that book know nothing about what the rules are. They don't know what the boundaries are. So whenever students ask me about this, like, is it tacky to start a Patreon? Of course it's tacky to start a Patreon. Who cares? Why do you care? Because the aesthetics of your generation is different than the aesthetics of my generation. And it's supposed to be that way. You're supposed to tear down the structures that existed before you. And if you're not doing that, there's something wrong. So if you're going into an area where everybody that's a little older than you that's nervous, that's probably a good sign that it's a good direction to go in, because it's a direction that's maybe a little unsafe, and all structures are unstable. So what we'll say over and over again is something you shouldn't do is tacky, you shouldn't do is tacky. All of a sudden, somebody makes some real movement in that new area, and then suddenly it's legitimized by that person's movement. And so as a generation, there are going to be things like that where, so my advice is to just include it and try it. You can always, by process of elimination, delete it later if you're embarrassed by it. But if you don't try, then you don't know. And so I would say the only real regrets I have are actually show opportunities I turned down. I beat myself up about that all the time. Like, thinking about, I was asked to be in a show that was like in a hotel where everybody got a hotel room and decorated that hotel room. And I had been in a million shows like that, and I said no to one of them. And it was right in the middle of my divorce, and it was just a super complicated time in my life. And then the person who got my space wound up being represented by a really fabulous gallery in Los Angeles. And for years, I thought about that all the time. I was like, oh, the dealer walked right into the gallery, walked right into the space. And then the artist that she signed actually used airbrush, which is the same material I used. And so they picked somebody who was kind of like me, but not me. And then for, I beat myself up more about stuff I said no to than stuff I said yes to. Because like I said, you can always delete it if you want to.
Nicely answered. Thank you for that. I'm having trouble looking at the questions and listening to your thoughtful answers. There's some other questions just about the practicalities of being an artist, selling the work. You talked a little bit about maybe approaching galleries and how that might happen for young artists. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, or can you expand a little bit more about that?
So show up to everything. And this is also advice that I consider to come from Dave Hickey, because I read one of his books, and his advice was he owned a gallery, and that he always talked to the people who hung out the longest in the gallery, because he thought they must know what they're doing if they're sitting there for 30 minutes in front of the painting. And so when I first moved to LA, before I had a job, I would just show up to galleries and sit down. And if they had a bench, I sat down. If I was standing for a long enough time, somebody would come from the back and offer me a chair, almost always. And I met some really iconic dealers in Los Angeles because they wanted to know who would stand in front of a painting for 30 minutes. And sometimes it wasn't even that long. People would come out from the back. But one of the best conversations I had was with Patricia Faurer, who was a, kind of like a grande dame of the art world at the time. And she came out from the back and she said, who are you? Who no one sits with work this long. And then she said, but I love this work. I want to hear what's drawing you to it. And it was a Michael Miller painting, which was an all over field painting, this beautifully patterned. And I said, there's just something really hypnotic about the work. And I feel like if I look at it long enough, it's going to change. And already it's starting to change. Like I can see my eyes are freaking out a little bit. And she started laughing and she said, that only happens after about, and I said, I know, like 10 minutes. And we had this long conversation about the painting. And then she never forgot me. And same thing with Randy Summer at Acme. I always wanted to show at Acme. And I sat there with a Laura Owens painting for forever until he came out from the back and said, who are you? Why are you staring at this white painting? And it was this big white cloud painting. And I was like, I don't know. It's just really beautiful. But if you stand and you show up, and you ask questions and you're polite, people are going to talk to you eventually. And they may blow you off because you didn't go to grad school, wherever, Cal Arts. But, eventually they're going to want to know what motivated you to do that. And so eventually over time, everything folds to that kind of repetition and the practice of just looking. So showing up is the biggest thing. Doing something that nobody else wants to do is another thing. Nobody likes to write about other people's work. Every artist wants to be in a show, but nobody wants to curate the show for other people. So I took that advice and I started putting together curatorial ideas and approaching spaces for artists. And so, it's a lot easier to walk up to a dealer and say, hey, I have a show curated that's about this concept and we have this anchor artist in the show. I got Sandeep Mukherjee to say he would be in the show. Would you like to look at it? And people will go, oh, I like Sandeep's work. I don't know who the hell you are, but that sounds like a good idea. And they'd read it. And so, I was successful doing that. The first 2 times I did it, I had to pay to have a pop-up, and I had to pay rent on a space that I paid for like 3 days in Hollywood to have a space. But after a while, people, it was much easier to approach a commercial gallery space if I had images of a stage exhibition with artists that they knew. And so a lot of times galleries are looking for art shows to fill slots that are unpopular, like summertime, because, people with money travel in the summer. And so they're just looking for something to fill their summer program with. And 30 different artists that are going to bring 10 friends, that's 300 people at your gallery opening. So some of it is a numbers game. A big group show brings a lot of people and it brings a lot of young people. And so it helps stay on sort of the front edge of what's happening. And, whenever anybody asks, I just say, hey, you want a group show? Or even when people just mention, like, I don't know what to do next. And I just jump in with, would you like a group show? And I have a backlog of ideas. And part of our group is we write ideas before we have venues. We kind of have ongoing things happening in the background And so that when an opportunity comes up, we're ready to go. So we're prepared with an exhibition proposal. I'm pretty much only curate with the group now. I haven't done it independently in a long time, because frankly, it's easier if you have other people helping you than if you're trying to do everything by yourself.
I mean, you're clearly building momentum too. I mean, your network has grown. Artists that are producing in a variety of different ways. You have something to move around. Yeah,
Absolutely.
and you started with very little and built. So it's not an all at once kind of situation. There's more on this, of course. Students are, they're worried and they're wondering, how do I make money as a studio artist? I'm a studio artist about to graduate and have begun to wonder, do I need to go to graduate school? And I know you mentioned the graduate schools in the area here. What are your thoughts about artists that try to make it without that?
Well, Camilla Taylor, I believe, went to grad school at Long Beach. And so Camilla Taylor started out with an Etsy shop. And again, at the time when she was in grad school, no one wanted to have an Etsy shop. And that was thought of as being devaluing the work. Well, now she shows at Track 16. And part of the reason she shows at Track 16 is that she was making so much money on Etsy that they noticed. I mean, and so she's such a productive artist and she found a way to be commercially viable. And it worked for her and funded her studio long enough that people started to notice her work. And so one of the things that I think from my generation of artists is we were encouraged not to worry about money. That money was not an issue. Artists were not supposed to be concerned with capitalism. Capitalism was the enemy. However, if you're going to live in this city, you have to make a certain amount of money. So you have to have a work-life balance. And for me, that answer was art education, because if I were at school teaching, I was still engaging with my practice as an artist, and I could find the overlap between those two things. For other people, it is, working commercially and like I said, working with either Etsy or Patreon and trying to find different ways to have income streams. I sell a lot of prints on the side constantly, always. I don't make a lot of money on the prints, but it's enough that when I do my taxes, I can show that I'm a commercially viable artist.
Yeah.
And then you get your incentives for doing that in terms of the tax code. I definitely could not live in my house if I wasn't also a professor. I mean, so I think that that's one of the things that, with an artist, especially if an artist who's selling in galleries, it's feast or famine. You're either selling a lot or you're selling nothing, and then you're selling a lot and then you're selling nothing. And so there's this very normal, I think, wave of up and down that happens. And so you do kind of need, a B job to sort of live and exist, unless you're a trust fund kid. And if that's the case, then go for it, just make your work. But that was not my situation. So I didn't have that as an option. Still am super envious of people that have that as an option. It just was never an option for me. So I always felt like I had to have 3 jobs. And again, part of that is having immigrant parents who, my dad owned a diner, and it was open 24 hours a day. So if somebody didn't come to work, one person in my family had to go. Yeah. Otherwise, the store would shut down, which was not an option. So every person in my family had a job. And I remember when you turned 14, that's when you were old enough to work for your parents. And so you could work with a family business before the legal time that you needed to have because of child labor laws. And so I remember turning 14, and then that was the big deal, because then you could go work. And my first job was as cashier, then busboy, then a dishwasher, then finally waitress, which was like if you made it through all the tiers, then you got to be a waitress when you made tips, which was amazing. My brother did all that stuff and then became a cook, and so we all sort of worked together. And I spent most of my family time, or a large percentage of my family time, from 14 to I'd say 20 in the restaurant. And I wouldn't have seen my dad otherwise, probably, if I hadn't been working with him. But nobody wants to work with their parents. So I also had a job working as a bartender at night. And then I would see people sometimes because I would work happy hour, like after school, after my classes ended, I'd work happy hour. And then I would see people. So I'd go in at 4 o'clock and then work till 8 o'clock. And then my shift at the diner would start at 10. And then I would work till 3 o'clock in the morning. And I did that all the time. And I did that throughout school because that's how I paid for school. So I think that going from that to teaching and making work seems so easy by comparison. that it was like, oh, this is wonderful. Nobody's throwing anything at me, and I don't smell like, I don't smell gross when I come home from work. I don't smell like French fries anymore. That working in a classroom seemed like a really clean, wonderful job, and it felt easier. But if you are an artist, it's great to have a business plan, and but unless you're planning to make T-shirts and screen prints and skateboards, you're probably not going to survive on just making your work unless you utilize new technology to do that. So, do I know people who have minted NFTs and made a lot of money this year? Yes, I do. And I do know people that they're supporting themselves now, making work in ways that I never thought were possible. So it is possible to find a new avenue to make work, but you have to also find an avenue that's sustainable and ethical for you as an artist. Like, are you willing to do that? With what are you willing to do? What are you not willing to do? And some of it is taste, like I don't know that I would, I never thought I would sell T-shirts. And then I got asked to be in an exhibition in Chicago, and it was in a weird space. And I knew that the space, because of the nature of the space, we weren't going to sell a lot of work. So instead I made 100 T-shirts and then sold out of all the T-shirts. So I was like, well, that's equivalent to selling an artwork if I can sell T-shirts. And it was just a reproduction of one of the paintings. Right. On a black shirt. And so I felt like they were kind of buying the painting because it was a black field with the white diamond on it. And so it didn't bother me. And then Diamond Skate Supply Company started making basically the same shirt and selling it. And I went, oh, well, I had like a good 3-month run of selling that shirt and making all the money. And now now they're going to get all the credit for it, but that's fine with me because I don't want to be known as somebody who sells T-shirts either. So it was just an opportunity. I needed to make money to pay for the shipping and movement of the work and to just make it through that time. And so it filled the gap for me. And it was a good thing to do at the time. I don't have that up on my website though. Like I don't talk about it that much, but I did it when I had to. And so I'm a big proponent of doing what you have to do to survive.
Yeah. And use that word hustle. I think it often is that. Yeah. Here, this changes course a little bit, but I'll ask it. You referenced ancient Sumerians and how women had much more power then. I've been wondering what kind of world we have now if we were what kind of world we would have now if we were matriarchal. Do you think the world might be a different place?
Well, I mean, think about it within our own lifetime. Would the world be a different place had Hillary Clinton been elected? It's a good question, right? I mean, I don't know. It seems like it would be right now, especially because of geopolitics, right? I personally feel that, yes, it would be a better and a different place. And so like I said, I carry this historical guilt because a lot of the codification of oppression of women goes back to ancient Greek law. The codification of wearing a veil, the codification of staying in the domestic space, the house, and never going out without someone else with you. Those rules about women as property, they go back to ancient cultures, but predating those cultures. And a really wonderful book to buy is Goddess by Maria Gimbutas. And it goes through all of the icons and images that come from goddess worship prior to patriarchal culture, and the difference in the way that women's bodies were revered, and that there was a magical component to the woman's body, that we were objects of creation. And that influence on the way that people were, the children were raised, for example, like as they're excavating in Çatalhöyük in Turkey, they did not find evidence of single family dwellings, which is what everybody thought was going to happen when they started excavating. Instead, they found evidence of communal living spaces where people who are not related lived together in like dormitories. So the evidence is more like an Ursula K. Le Guin fantasy story about an alternative society where people are raised in communal structures where there isn't one person at home with a baby. There's a whole bunch of kids together with a rotating group of families that watch, or caretakers that watch. A really great book to read is Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. And her parents were anthropologists. Her mother wrote the book Ishi, which is an amazing and an important book of anthropology, because it really illustrates the sort of end game of colonialism, which is to put an indigenous person on display in a museum. It's like a horrific but also fascinating example of what anthropology really does. She took that idea of anthropology and applied it to fantasy fiction, and this idea of what if a society looked different what would happen if our society wasn't composed of single family units? Instead, it was composed of community-based situations. How would that work? Would there be a gender binary? Would it exist or would it not exist? Because would there be a less contentious, less warlike culture? And in her story, in that particular story, the answer was, yeah, it'd be very different, right? So, and I think that those issues, those ideas of what if the world were structured in a different way around my body instead of the body of the other, how would it feel to be in that space? Those are things that fascinate me. And I read a lot of sci-fi, and it's embarrassing. I was taught to be embarrassed by it. But I also like to point out that the first sci-fi writer was actually, a woman. So Frankenstein is the first book of science fiction written by Mary Shelley. And so it's okay for me to be a girl that geeks out on that. And I try to own that. Although I've got to tell you, I've been in some arguments with people who don't believe it. They'll start, geeking out and questioning me. I love reading science fiction.
Me too. Me too. Simpler question, but I like it. First, a complimentary start. Hey, Mary, enjoying the paintings. I'm into stuff like this. How long does it take to make a typical painting? And then they go on to ask, do you still use a sketchbook, which you talked about? And then there's another question that I noticed a little bit down the list here, wondering if you are curious about incorporating other techniques, weaving, and maybe embroidery, other kinds of materials in your painting works.
So, I actually have a giant bag of Reticella lace that I just got from my stepmom, who's clearing out a closet, and it's like a mountain of lace that was my grandmother's, and it's all handmade lace. And I'm definitely going to use that in my installation in Spokane. I haven't figured out how I'm going to use it, or whether I'm going to physically incorporate it or be designed based on it. But it's super fascinating to me as an actual document of somebody's life, that this is all the handwork that this one person did, or at least the handwork that was given to me. And it fills up a hefty bag, which is the most bizarre thing, because it's the amount of repetitive action that's there. It explains a lot to me of my personality. Like, oh, that's what I do. I just do it in painting. I don't do it in with needlework, but it is absolutely the same structure that are underneath all the lace forms are just like the paintings, which is, it's in my DNA. So I think that it's part of the way that I structure a painting is I sort of work from a grid and then work that way. I have never used textiles and fibers, mostly because I think I respect and admire textile and fiber artists so much. Like I said, I found Diedrich Brackens to be just incredibly inspirational when he was working at Long Beach, and watching him work and dye and work on that is a field I often felt like, okay, this is something I would not want to be a novice at, especially, and I think that's one of the things that happens as you get older, you kind of stay in your lane. But I'm excited about the possibilities of what that can bring, because again, it's a new situation I've been thrown into. I didn't expect to get a bag of lace after, I just got it 2 weeks ago. So now I have a new problem or interesting element to incorporate into the show that I hadn't anticipated. And so I know it's going to show up. I just don't know how yet. And yes, I definitely use a sketchbook. I'm a big advocate of having different size sketchbooks so that no matter what you're carrying, you always are able to write it down. No matter what, because you just don't know when inspiration is going to strike. And I always think of the sketchbook as like a big basket that you're holding out to catch, the manna from heaven. Like, you don't know when the gods are going to shower down fruit, and you want to make sure that you have something to catch. And so, I have one around me at all times. And like I said, it's super important for me to periodically go through them too, and then think about how this one idea is needling me. It's so easy to lose track of your thoughts in our culture right now because of the bombarding of information. We're just so bombarded by information. And I think the slow process of writing it down, there's a wonderful article by Dr. Betty Edwards called What is Lost as Handwriting Fades. And she makes a really strong argument that handwriting and the process of writing things down creates extra connections in the brain that makes work stay with you, that makes what you're learning stay with you longer. And so if you do write it down, you have a physical record, but you also have an imprint in your brain that it's a neural pathway that's been created. And Dr. Edwards was in art education at Cal State Long Beach, and she wrote the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. A lot of what she wrote was debunked, but her processes in drawing are still the same processes that you probably learned when you were in high school or in drawing one. And so they are absolutely fundamental for teaching people who don't know how to look for the first time, and how to observe and how to record. So much of that has to do with using our hands, and instead of using a keyboard, but actually physically manipulating a tool. And this is really important. And you cannot be smarter than the work that you're making. You have to actually physically make the work. And there's a simplicity in labor that is tied to our brain, and we forget that. All of the achievements in human history, if you think about it, go back to the beginning of a creature holding an implement, holding a tool. And so there's something that is activated in the brain when you move your hands. And so if you're moving your hands and you're thinking at the same time, you're going to have a more intense process. And it's super important to artists, no matter what your media is, to always use your hands. And it just triggers more of your brain and more of your imagination.
Oh, nicely answered. Nicely answered. Oh, a part of that question, and I'm just curious too, and I think others are, is just about how long does it take to make one of your paintings?
So that's a hard question, because in the beginning, it takes an incredible amount of time. Like when I'm trying to figure out a process, I'm like trial and error, and it's a lot of failed paintings. And it might take me 3 months to finish one that's a mess. And then once I get the process down, I get faster and faster and faster. So right now I was like, right in the middle of winter break, I was like, I could do one of these every 2 weeks. And then like, it's not true. Like it takes me legitimately 4 to 6 weeks to finish one, like the one behind me. Mm-hmm. When I have uninterrupted free time, I can go faster. Like in the summer, I definitely go faster, and I definitely go faster over breaks than when I'm stopping to teach. But I do have a full course load that I teach, and I run huge programs. So, those are part of my practice too. So I wind up switching and going back in and out. And so I always have this philosophy of, I want to leave myself marks so that I can go back into this space and I can come back in. And so a lot of my work is, I leave things off mid-process so that I know exactly where I left off and how I can get back in to the process, or I number things so I know what step I'm on. And again, that's a tedious element of making the work, but allows me to drop in and drop out of the process, because I'm also a mother. So I have a kid who went through quarantine, just like all of you guys did, taking Zooming classes from home during her high school experience. And so that in and of itself was an ordeal that all of us as people went through, as families went through. And it's been a difficult time. At the height of quarantine, my husband works at Woodbury University. I work at Cal State Fullerton, and my daughter was taking classes in high school. And so we were all three Zooming at the same time, which if you've done that is like terrible. Everybody's server was crashing at the same time, and it was a big hot mess. But you just do what you have to do to make it through. And it might take me longer in the beginning, but at the end, I sort of pick up a rhythm and a pace, and then it's pretty predictable. But if you look back at when you look at it all together, it looks like a lot of work. When I'm making work, it feels incredibly slow. But I try not to think about quantity. I just try to think about what's right in front of me right now. And then as I work, I get faster naturally. So.
Nicely answered. Nicely answered. You also touch on balance too, and having to, you're doing so many different things simultaneously. It is a sort of a question that, I had, how do you stay balanced and manage all this stuff?
Exercise.
Yeah, practice.
Exercise. And another thing is, go for walks, swim.
Yeah.
Do what you have to do to take care of your body. And that's hard in your 20s. You don't care about taking care of your body very much because it serves you. You can go out and abuse yourself and then come back the next day 12 hours later. You can work 12 hours in a row. It doesn't bother you. As you age, that becomes less and less possible. As more people rely on you, you suddenly realize that you have to live in this body. And so no one's going to take care of it for you. You have to take care of it for yourself. And so part of, I think, being successful as an artist is allowing yourself the time and space that you need to have to be mentally well. So always paying for therapy, or finding a therapist who will talk to you for free, or who will trade for artwork, which is amazing if you can find that. By the way, shout out the LGBTB. I'm saying it wrong because I'm tired, but the LGBTQ Center in Los Angeles has free counseling for anybody that applies. If you are in desperate need of counseling once you're out of school, because I know that you have counseling services and programs when you're in college. in the art department, in the arts in general, we do have a higher percentage of people that have, you know, are neurologically divergent. I'll say that. And rather than thinking of that as a liability, think of it as an asset that needs maintenance. So it's a gift, but it comes with tremendous responsibility. So because you're given this vision to create, it also gives you the responsibility of maintaining that vision and maintaining your body in the temple that you live in. So I know for myself, if I don't physically get enough exercise, and if I don't talk to my therapist and take my medication, I am not going to be as happy and as productive. And my life will spiral out of control. Now, did I know that when I was 25? No, I had to crash and burn a lot of times before I figured that out. But now I stick to that like glue, because I know that I can't live as an artist unless I maintain my life, that I am at the center of all of that. So.
Mariana, there are more questions, and
oh, it's so late too. I can't believe I talked that much. I thought I ran out of things to say.
That was fantastic. You know, and I'm seeing in the chat, you know, there are two things happening here. You know, students are begging to continue, and students have to go do other things. And you have been incredibly generous. This may be a good time to stop since we are at time.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate it. And I know it's late for you guys and you have to leave. But if you ever have any questions, or you're interested in studying at Cal State Fullerton and studying art education, you can contact me at mpomonis@fullerton.edu. And I'll put that in the chat. And shout out, I probably have, because it's been a few years, but there might be one or two people in the audience who were in my class. And because I can't see you, I can't say hi, but I recognize a couple names. And if you ever want to contact me and ask a question, you're more than welcome to.
Oh, you're so generous. You know, the one thing that certainly the downside of the webinar is there isn't a standing ovation for you at this moment. It's anticlimactic for you after all of that.
All right.
But,
all right.
Mariana Pomonis, everybody, thank you so much
for asking me. I'm really, it's a joy to be here.
Oh man.
Thank you, Hannah. So people are saying nice things and applauding. Thank you so much for being here.
That was incredibly generous. I can't say it enough. Thank you for spending your evening with us.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
So long. Have a good night. Be well. Have a good spring break.
I will. Yay.
Yay.
Bye.
All right, everybody. You guys all have good nights. Thanks for joining us once again. Remember, we have an extra week to complete this week's response. Have a good spring break. Be careful. Be safe out there, everybody. Let me know if you need anything. You guys too. Have good spring breaks, y'all. All right, email me if you need anything. You all be well. I'll see you in 2 weeks. I'm signing off. Good night.